Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. Today is the second week of Advent, and hopefully by now you've already started to incorporate and understand Advent as more than a season. This is an understanding of what it is to live in the place that we live, a Christian life, and the times in which we live. I wonder if you have a sense today of that as you approach these readings, as you hear especially that reading about John the Baptist. I wonder in your mind if you have kind of a picture of what it looks like, especially in terms of geography. So geography is really important when it comes to the story of John the Baptist early on, especially out there in the wilderness. I wonder if you've been to Israel before and had the pleasure of seeing the terrain as you move east from Jerusalem through the Judean desert down toward the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. If you've not seen that before, perhaps you've seen something like it. It's terrain that's similar, I know, in the American Southwest. I am familiar with areas like that, flying in and out of the cities of Bolivia. It's dry and oppressive. It is jagged in spite of the fact that through centuries and millennia, the hot winds have carried sand from the desert and worn down edge after edge, but every time a new edge appears, it's not soft and smooth. It's almost as if a new knife edge has been formed and honed. Land filled with scarcity and isolation and darkness, because even in the middle of the day, if it's anything other than the light being cast perfectly into the area you're looking, the shadows can be overwhelming. There's a reason that land, the word wilderness at all in the Hebrew mindset, became so important, and it happened before there was ever even a Bible to name. That area, not just the Judean desert, but any other place like it, was understood both literally and figuratively for as long as there were people who knew it. Because at any time, that place of scarcity and isolation and darkness where death could come and find you, at any time, that could be both the desert and our lives. That could be both a place, a geographical terrain, as well as a spiritual one. We know what it's like to have lives that are filled with a sense of scarcity and isolation and darkness and pain. We know what it's like to be in a place where it seems like we can't find our way out, where there are places too high and places too low and places too crooked and terrain that's too rough. We become lost. And death, literally or figuratively, comes looking for us. And yet, in the biblical tradition, something new begins to happen in that place called the wilderness. It starts off with a story that I imagine you know well. Maybe we could say it starts here. When God meets Moses in the wilderness, calls him out into the wilderness, actually, because figuratively, he was already experiencing wilderness as he lived in the oppression and heat of Egypt, lost already. Death was coming to look for the children of the Hebrews. God meets Moses in the wilderness and says two things to him. Go back and comfort the people, and announce to them that God is with them and that everything will change. Call them out into the wilderness where I will meet them to comfort them and be with them and change them. God would do all the changing. Moses just had to do the announcing and the comforting, right? That is the definitive story in almost all of the Old Testament. It's the one that dominates the landscape of the Old Testament for centuries and centuries of its forming, for chapters and chapters of page turning, and not much of anything changes until we are met again with disaster. A new kind of disaster this time, though it looks a lot like the old kind, when the Babylonians have destroyed all the framework for society in the Israelite people. moved them through the desert into captivity again. God seems to be missing. There is no comfort. And it seems like nothing can change. And into that context, into that wilderness, a new tradition is born. A new kind of what we would call prophetic tradition, where folks like Isaiah and Jeremiah and others will step forward not only to proclaim comfort and to announce the good news of God's being there, but also to call the people to make the changes that God expects to have happen. The words that we have from the prophet Isaiah in our reading from Luke today echo back to the 40th chapter of Isaiah. Isaiah, go and proclaim comfort to my people, and that God is with them, and then cry out to them. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Those high places, those rugged mountains will be made low if you make them low. Fill up those low places. Smooth out those rough places. Make a highway that God might enter through it to find God's children in the wilderness, to be alongside them, to comfort them himself. Subtle, but do you hear the slight change? Yes, there is comfort that comes from God. Yes, God is with us. And then there's work to do. Go out into the wilderness. Make those proclamations and get your hands dirty, we might say. That's the summation of that prophetic tradition, and it's the one that is going to carry through for the next 2,000, 3,000 years. Before Jesus, there was a prophet named Baruch. His writings came so late that he didn't exactly make the cut in the Bible. We read his works. Truly, what he does is just rehash what the prophets had said before him, because people were still experiencing that spiritual wilderness. They were still experiencing the darkness, even in the midst of daylight. They still knew what it was to be in a dry and barren land. They still knew what it was for the paths to be so crooked that they could get lost in there and never find their way out, to be so comfortless and isolated that they would think that God could not possibly be with them. Baruch said, take off that garment of sorrow and affliction and look to the east, where God is bringing the people back. And God has ordered that every high mountain and the everlasting hills be made low, and the valleys filled up to make level ground, so that Israel may walk safely in the glory of God. God has commanded that the work be done, to bring the high places low and fill up the valleys that there might be level ground. When John the Baptist comes onto the scene, maybe 200 years later, John the Baptist looks around and there is still a wilderness. There are still those children of God that are so isolated, so comfortless, so hopeless, so lost in darkness that someone has to say more than just, it's okay, God's with you. Someone has to say more than, I hope you feel better. Someone has to say, it's time to make the changes necessary that God might reach out to the children who are in the wilderness. John the Baptist uses the word repent. It's a sermon for another day, but at the very least we might say change. And not just you and your heart, but we as a people change those high places and those low places and those rough places and those crooked places, that the glory of God might shine on all of God's children. This is the prophetic tradition. Like the prophets who have come before us, like John the Baptist, like Baruch, like Isaiah, like all of them, it's the tradition in which we stand to be people who say more than simply, it's okay. To be people who say more than simply God is with you, though sometimes it seems like that's all we can say. To be a people who, too, go about the work of dismantling those things in our hearts, in our lives, in our society that continue to be crooked or rough or too high or too low. Those things that make the wilderness literal instead of merely figurative. Clear out those things that keeps God's glory, God's light from shining into even the darkest places of our hearts and of our lives. That's Advent. I wonder if you've ever thought of it that way. Advent is a place where we experience something of the darkness because it happens around a dark time of year, all the better that we have a rainstorm today. Advent is a time in our lives where we reflect on the fact that we say over and over again that Christ has come and is coming, and all the glory of God is so beautifully displayed in our Christmas trees and in our wreaths. And yet we know that even among ourselves and in our hearts, there are those of us who are calling out from isolation and scarcity and fierce oppression. We're calling out from the wilderness saying, where is the comfort? Where is this God that we say is with us? The work surely is not done yet. As an Advent people, we are called to agree and say the work is not done yet. To be a people who say, be comforted, surely. And yes, God is with you, even in the desert, even in your wilderness, even in those shadows. There is no true thing about that isolation that you experience. That is a lie. You are never alone. And then to go about the work, rock by rock, brick by brick, piece by piece, of taking those mountains down and filling up those valleys, that nothing might stand in the way of God's glory from reaching each child of God. That's the work of the church, not just for a season. It's the work of the church always. It's the work we are called to do, and God grants us the grace to do. It's the work that I hope we will do more and more as a church that believes that God is calling us into it and has given us every providential gift needed for us to accomplish it. It's the work that we do for one another when you and I experience the deep darkness of the wilderness. And that's what it means to be a part of this community. I want to leave you with a story that I heard recently from a parishioner. She's one of those parishioners who has many miraculous stories. And for a skeptic like me, it's so good to hear those miraculous stories, because there are so often periods in my life where I step back and think, miracles can't really be. And she sat down the other day and told me a story as we were talking about children, and she is now in her 90s, so she's gone through the thing a couple of times now. She told the story of the first time she ever lost one of her children. Not the last, just the first. She was at a festival in a major metropolitan area, and there was wonderful music and throngs of people. Perhaps millions of people added into a city that already had millions of people. Grand celebration, and as her family was getting ready to leave, they were going toward a subway system, and they were getting ready to get on the train. The din, the noise was so incredible as music continued to fill the air and as the crowds of people talking lost their distinctive voices and just became background noise. As the sound of train brakes squealing as new trains came in the station or pulled off filled the air. She suddenly sort of couldn't hear anything for the fact that she heard everything. And then she realized that her child was no longer next to her. She absolutely froze, hoping to hear the voice of her child, but absolutely it was impossible. She knew that she couldn't hear it for anything. So she began to feel an acute and absolute and immediate hopelessness, joylessness. She had gone from her own mountain peak to the middle of the wilderness in a breath. As her despair began to creep deeper into her heart, and grief began to well up, though she couldn't quite name it, suddenly all of the noise disappeared. Every sound of every train, every sound from the music, the voices of the people surrounding her, the shuffling of feet, all of it disappeared. She heard as clear as a bell the voice of her daughter. "I'm right here, Mom. Come and get me." She didn't know where the voice came from, so she just turned in the direction that she thought was the right one, and she began to walk. And sure enough, she found her daughter. Joy was returned to her life. Her moment of wilderness vanished. Light shined in the darkness that she was experiencing. She experienced what the Bible would call salvation. She was led away with joy in the light of God's glory. In that story, I understand that you and I are often that mom, suddenly finding ourselves lost in the despair of the wilderness, and that there are countless throngs of people in this world who consistently, daily experience that despair. God is the voice that breaks through the noise and breaks through our despair to say, "I am here, and it is okay, and we will be united." The church, if we are at our best, is that force in the world that quiets the noise. That force in the world that through our actions and our prayers and our love will make the noises of the world cease, that everyone might hear the voice of God with abundance and clarity, like a bell ringing through the silence. It is okay. God is with you. And we will be forever together. May God grant us the grace to change and to answer God's call, that we might be ones who bring every high mountain low, fill every valley, make the crooked places straight and the rough places smooth, and allow God's voice and God's glory to shine on all of God's children. Amen.